Captain Murphy's resistance cell had grown into something approaching a shadow military during Morrison's time underground. Operating from hidden bases scattered throughout the outer system, Murphy had gathered evidence of corruption while recruiting personnel who still believed in humanity's original war aims. Morrison's survival and testimony provided the final pieces needed to expose the full scope of Pierce's betrayal. Morrison found himself at the center of a network that included intelligence, officers, combat veterans, technical specialists, and civilian contractors who had grown suspicious of recent policy changes. Murphy had been careful to recruit only people whose loyalty to humanity exceeded their obedience to corrupted leadership, creating an organization that operated parallel to official military structures. The evidence Morrison's team had recovered from the Zephyrian prison facility revealed that Pierce's conspiracy included senior officers throughout the fleet command structure. Supply officers had been diverting weapons and equipment to alien forces. Intelligence officers had been providing targeting data for attacks on human positions, and medical personnel had been sharing research on human physiology that aided alien experimentation programs. Morrison learned that the war itself had become a profitable enterprise for the conspirators, who were selling military secrets to the highest bidders while positioning themselves to benefit regardless of which side ultimately achieved victory. Pierce had transformed what should have been humanity's united effort into a business opportunity that treated human lives as expendable resources. Morrison's reputation as the ghost of Zerion began spreading through both official and underground networks. Stories of his survival against impossible odds and his relentless pursuit of justice inspired others to question the official narrative of recent military operations. Morrison had become a symbol of human determination that could not be suppressed or controlled. The resistance began conducting surgical strikes against Zephyrian facilities that were secretly cooperating with corrupted human leadership. Morrison led raids that liberated human prisoners while gathering additional evidence of the conspiracy's scope. Each operation was planned and executed with precision that combined Morrison's enhanced combat skills with his team's specialized expertise. Carlos's demolitions work had evolved during his captivity to include techniques learned from studying alien explosive compounds. His shaped charges could now penetrate Zephyrian armor and destroy their technology with devastating effectiveness. Despite losing his arm, Carlos had adapted his techniques to work with prosthetic equipment that exceeded his original capabilities. Lisa's damaged eyesight had been compensated by enhanced perception that made her an even more deadly sniper than before. Her ability to detect heat signatures and movement patterns allowed her to target enemies in conditions where normal vision would be useless. Lisa had learned to see through alien camouflage systems that fooled electronic sensors. Tony's medical knowledge now included intimate familiarity with alien physiology and enhancement procedures. His understanding of both human and Zephyrian biology made him capable of treating injuries that would have been fatal to conventional medical personnel. Tony had also learned to identify the signs of alien experimentation in rescued prisoners. Karen's experience with neural control implants had given her unprecedented insight into alien computer systems and communication networks. She could now penetrate Zephyrian data systems with techniques that combined human intuition with alien logic patterns. Karen had become a bridge between human and alien technology that served the Resistance's intelligence needs. Morrison coordinated these enhanced capabilities into a fighting force that struck without warning and disappeared before retaliation was possible. The Resistance team's tactics combined human military doctrine with lessons learned from Vorthak pack hunting and alien technology integration. They had become something that neither human nor alien forces were prepared to counter. The conspiracy's response to Morrison's activities revealed the true scope of Pierce's influence within the command structure. Assassination attempts were disguised as training accidents. Supply shortages affected units whose loyalty was questionable, and personnel transfers moved potentially troublesome officers to positions where they could be monitored or eliminated. Morrison realized that Pierce was using the war itself as cover for a systematic purge of human military leadership that might oppose his plans. Officers who asked uncomfortable questions about recent policy changes found themselves assigned to suicide missions, while those who demonstrated flexibility regarding alien cooperation received rapid promotions and increased authority. The Resistance network began coordinating with civilian populations who had grown suspicious of the increasingly close cooperation between human and alien forces. Workers in shipyards reported that vessels were being modified with alien technology that served no obvious military purpose, while transport crews discovered that supply routes were being redirected to benefit Zephyrian logistics rather than human combat needs. Morrison's investigation revealed that Pierce was planning something far more ambitious than simple military cooperation with alien forces. Communication intercepts suggested preparations for a formal treaty that would essentially surrender human independence in exchange for technological advancement and guaranteed survival for select human populations. The proposed treaty would establish Pierce and his co-conspirators as governors of human territories under Zephyrian oversight, with enhanced human soldiers serving as enforcers and administrators. The experimental programs Morrison had witnessed were designed to create a compliant human population that could be controlled through technological means rather than simple force. Morrison understood that the upcoming peace summit represented the culmination of Pierce's long-term planning. If the treaty was signed, it would legitimize the surrender of human independence while portraying Pierce as a visionary leader who had saved humanity from certain destruction. The Resistance would be branded as terrorists opposing humanity's survival. Morrison began planning a campaign that would expose Pierce's betrayal during the peace summit itself, using the global attention focused on the event to reveal the true cost of the proposed treaty. The operation would require perfect timing and flawless execution, as failure would not only doom the Resistance but validate Pierce's narrative about extremist opposition to peace. Morrison's team prepared for what they all understood might be their final mission. They had survived betrayal, captivity, and impossible odds to reach this point, but the upcoming confrontation would test everything they had learned about warfare, survival, and the true meaning of loyalty to humanity's values. The Resistance gathered intelligence on the summit security arrangements while positioning assets throughout the facility where the treaty would be signed. Morrison coordinated with Murphy to ensure that evidence of Pierce's crimes would be transmitted simultaneously to news networks, military commands, and civilian governments throughout human space. Morrison felt the weight of responsibility for humanity's future settling on his shoulders as he finalized preparations for the confrontation with Pierce. His Modoc ancestors had faced impossible odds when fighting for their people's survival, and Morrison drew strength from their example as he prepared to honor their legacy in a completely different kind of battle. The Ghost of Zarian was about to step out of the shadows and demand justice for the crimes committed against humanity itself. Pierce had made the mistake of assuming that betrayal could be hidden through violence and corruption, but Morrison intended to prove that some warriors could not be broken, bought, or silenced. The peace summit was held aboard the massive diplomatic station orbiting Kepler Prime, a neutral world chosen specifically for its symbolic value as humanity's first successful colony outside the Sol system. Representatives from dozens of human worlds gathered alongside Zephyrian delegates in a ceremony that was broadcast live to billions of beings throughout the galaxy. Morrison and his team infiltrated the station 3 days before the summit began, using credentials provided by Resistance, members who had placed themselves in key positions throughout the diplomatic security apparatus. They moved through the station's service passages and maintenance areas, while avoiding the sophisticated surveillance systems that monitored every public space. Pierce arrived with a security detail that included soldiers Morrison recognized as enhanced humans who had undergone the same experimental procedures his team had endured. The colonel had surrounded himself with warriors whose loyalty had been guaranteed through technological modification rather than genuine conviction, creating a personal guard that would follow orders without question or moral consideration. Morrison established his team in positions throughout the summit facility, while Captain Murphy coordinated the transmission of evidence to news networks and military commands across human space. The revelation of Pierce's crimes would be synchronized with Morrison's personal confrontation, ensuring that the truth could not be suppressed even if the Resistance fighters were eliminated. The first day of the summit proceeded exactly as Pierce had planned, with speeches about humanity's need for peace and cooperation, echoing through chambers filled with delegates who had no idea they were witnessing the surrender of their species' independence. Pierce presented himself as a visionary leader who understood that survival required adaptation and compromise. Morrison watched from concealment as Pierce signed preliminary agreements that established the framework for human-Zephyrian cooperation in dozens of sectors ranging from technology transfer to population management. Each signature brought humanity closer to a future where freedom would be traded for security under alien oversight. The Zephyrian delegates included senior military commanders who Morrison recognized from intelligence files as architects of the experimental programs that had tortured human prisoners. These beings sat in positions of honor while being celebrated as partners in humanity's peaceful future, their crimes forgotten in the name of diplomatic necessity. Morrison's team began their operation during the summit's second day, when the formal treaty signing was scheduled to take place before representatives of the galactic media. Carlos disabled the station's internal communication systems, while Lisa took position to provide overwatch of the main ceremonial chamber. Tony prepared medical support for the inevitable casualties, while Karen worked to penetrate the station's computer networks. Morrison emerged from the shadows as Pierce approached the signing table, stepping into the ceremonial chamber with weapons crafted from Vorthak bone and alien technology that spoke of battles fought in darkness against impossible odds. His appearance sent shockwaves through the assembled delegates, many of whom recognized the ghost of Zirian from intelligence reports they had thought were exaggerated propaganda. Pierce's reaction to Morrison's appearance revealed the depth of his corruption and fear. The colonel immediately ordered his enhanced guards to eliminate Morrison, while claiming that terrorists were attempting to disrupt humanity's path to peace. Pierce's willingness to use violence in front of galactic media demonstrated his desperation to prevent the truth from being revealed. The battle that followed was broadcast live to billions of viewers as Morrison fought Pierce's enhanced soldiers in the chamber where humanity's future was being decided. Morrison's combat skills, honed through months of warfare against enhanced predators, proved superior to the technological modifications that Pierce had relied upon to create loyal servants. Karen's penetration of the station's networks allowed her to override the media blackout that Pierce's allies attempted to impose, ensuring that Morrison's accusations and the evidence of Pierce's crimes reached audiences throughout human space. The carefully orchestrated surrender of human independence became a public trial of the corruption that had infected humanity's leadership. Morrison's personal confrontation with Pierce took place in the chamber's center, while chaos erupted around them. Pierce had undergone enhancement procedures himself, gaining physical capabilities that exceeded normal human limits. But Morrison's experience fighting creatures that were naturally superior had taught him that technology could not replace the warrior spirit that drove true strength. Pierce fought with desperation born of fear, using stolen Zephyrian technology to enhance his speed and strength, while relying on tactical implants that should have given him overwhelming advantages. Morrison countered with skills that combined ancestral warrior traditions with hard-learned lessons about survival against superior forces, proving that the human spirit could not be defeated by artificial enhancement. The duel between Morrison and Pierce became a symbol of humanity's choice between surrender and resistance, between technological dependence and spiritual independence. Morrison fought not just for personal justice but for the right of humanity to determine its own destiny without alien oversight or technological control of human consciousness. Morrison's victory came when he managed to destroy Pierce's enhancement implants using techniques learned from studying alien technology during his captivity. Without artificial augmentation, Pierce was revealed as the coward he had always been, a man who had sold his species freedom because he lacked the courage to fight for values that transcended personal survival. Pierce's death was broadcast throughout the galaxy as Morrison stood over the body of the man who had betrayed humanity's trust. The evidence of Pierce's crimes, transmitted simultaneously to news networks and military commands, revealed the full scope of the conspiracy and exposed the true cost of the proposed treaty. The summit collapsed as delegates realized they had been manipulated into supporting agreements that would have enslaved humanity rather than securing its peaceful future. The Zephyrian representatives withdrew under protection of diplomatic immunity, but their participation in Pierce's conspiracy had been exposed to galactic scrutiny. Morrison's team emerged from the chaos as heroes rather than terrorists, their survival against impossible odds proving that humanity possessed resources that could not be conquered or controlled. The resistance network that Captain Murphy had built became the foundation for a renewed war effort based on principles rather than political expediency. Morrison found himself reluctantly elevated to leadership positions that he had never sought, but his experience had taught him that true warriors served causes greater than themselves. He accepted responsibility for rebuilding humanity's military command structure while ensuring that the corruption Pierce had introduced could never take root again. The war against the Zephyrian Empire resumed under Morrison's leadership, but with a fundamental difference in approach that reflected lessons learned from Pierce's betrayal. Human forces would fight with honor and determination, rather than relying on technological shortcuts or alien cooperation that compromised their essential humanity. Morrison established new protocols that emphasized the warrior virtues his Modoc ancestors had valued: courage in the face of overwhelming odds, loyalty to principles rather than personalities, and the willingness to sacrifice for future generations rather than accepting comfortable slavery. These values became the foundation of humanity's renewed resistance. The ghost of Zarian had stepped out of the shadows to demand justice, and had received it through strength of arms and purity of purpose. Morrison's scars from his battles in the Vorthak caves served as permanent reminders that survival required more than superior technology or political maneuvering. It demanded the willingness to fight for what was right, regardless of personal cost. Morrison's story became legend throughout human space, inspiring a new generation of warriors who understood that freedom could never be taken for granted, and that the price of liberty was eternal vigilance against those who would trade independence for security. The Modoc warrior had honored his ancestors by proving that the human spirit could not be broken by any force that sought to control or corrupt it. The final victory belonged not to Morrison alone, but to every human who chose resistance over surrender, principle over expediency, and freedom over comfortable slavery. Pierce's betrayal had been answered with blood for justice, and humanity emerged stronger for having faced the darkness within its own ranks and chosen the harder path of honor over the easier road of submission. The new Alpha was larger than its predecessor, a scarred monster that bore the marks of countless battles fought in the deepest parts of the cave system. Morrison first saw the creature when it emerged from passages that his team had not yet explored, leading a pack that had grown rather than diminished since the previous leader's death. The beast stood almost 3 meters at the shoulder, with tusks that gleamed like polished ivory in the dim light of their salvaged illumination equipment. Morrison realized that the first Alpha had not been the strongest creature in the Vorthak hierarchy, but rather a middle-ranking leader that had been testing the human intruders. The true pack leader had been watching from the shadows, studying Morrison's tactics and capabilities, while allowing a subordinate to probe their defenses. Now that Morrison had proven himself a serious threat, the real monster had decided to take personal action. The creature's intelligence was immediately apparent in how it approached their fortified position. Instead of charging directly into their defensive fields, it sent smaller Vorthak to attack from multiple directions, while keeping the main pack in reserve. The attacks were probing moves designed to map their defensive capabilities and identify weaknesses, rather than serious attempts at assault. Morrison understood that he was facing an opponent that thought like a military commander rather than a simple predator. The creature was conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence, and planning a coordinated assault that would overwhelm their defenses through superior numbers and tactical coordination. Morrison's military training recognized the pattern, but his Modoc heritage suggested a different approach. Rather than wait for the inevitable assault, Morrison decided to take the fight directly to the new Alpha using tactics that would have been familiar to his ancestors when they faced the United States Army in the lava beds of Northern California. He would use the terrain to his advantage, strike without warning, and disappear before retaliation was possible. Morrison spent 2 days preparing for the confrontation, while his team maintained their defensive position. He crafted additional, weapons from the bones and tusks of fallen Vorthak, including a war club embedded with razor-sharp bone fragments that could shatter skulls and tear through hide. More importantly, he studied the creature's behavior patterns and identified the routes it used to move through the cave system. The Vorthak had their own territories within the cave complex, areas that were marked with scent markers and defended against intrusion. Morrison realized that the creatures operated under a social structure similar to wolf packs, with clearly defined hierarchies and territorial boundaries. The new Alpha's territory was the deepest and most secure part of the cave system, accessible only through narrow passages that could be easily defended. Morrison's attack came during what he had learned was the Vorthak equivalent of their rest period. He moved through the darkness using skills that combined military stealth training with hunting techniques passed down through generations of Modoc warriors. His approach was completely silent, his breathing controlled, his heartbeat steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The Alpha's lair was a vast chamber deep in the cave system, filled with the trophies of countless kills arranged in patterns that suggested ritual significance. Skulls from dozens of different species lined the walls, while weapons and equipment taken from human and Zephyrian victims were displayed like primitive art. The creature itself rested on a bed of bones that had been worn smooth by years of use. Morrison struck with the coordinated precision of a military assault, combined with the savage fury of a warrior fighting for survival. His first blow was a spear thrust aimed at the creature's spine, designed to cripple rather than kill. The bone point penetrated the thick hide, but struck the enhanced vertebrae that had been reinforced by Zephyrian genetic modification. The Alpha roared and spun with speed that defied its massive size, tusks slashing through the air where Morrison's head had been a split second earlier. Morrison rolled aside and came up with his war club, striking at the creature's left knee with enough force to shatter normal bone. The enhanced joint held, but the creature staggered and favored the injured leg. What followed was a battle that tested every skill Morrison had learned in his military career and every instinct inherited from his warrior ancestors. The creature was faster, stronger, and larger than anything Morrison had ever faced, but it was also predictable in ways that its smaller predecessors had not been. Size brought power but also limitations in mobility and reaction time. Morrison used the chamber's features to his advantage, leading the creature into areas where its size worked against it, while staying mobile enough to avoid the devastating attacks that could crush him instantly. The creature's tusks could punch through stone, but they could not hit what they could not catch. Morrison's Modoc ancestors had used similar tactics against cavalry charges, staying mobile and striking at vulnerable points while avoiding direct confrontation. The fight lasted almost an hour, far longer than any previous encounter with the Vorthak. Both combatants bled from dozens of wounds, Morrison from glancing blows that would have been instantly fatal if they had connected directly, the creature from precise strikes at joints and nerve clusters that Morrison had identified. During his study of Vorthak anatomy, Morrison's victory came through a combination of tactical thinking and desperate improvisation. He managed to maneuver the creature into a position where its own momentum worked against it, using a technique his great-great-grandfather might have recognized from battles fought with completely different weapons against entirely different enemies. The creature's charge carried it past Morrison's position, and Morrison drove his spear deep into the base of its skull, where the enhanced nervous system was most vulnerable. The Alpha died, as its predecessor had, instantly, and without the prolonged struggle that might have alerted the rest of the pack. Morrison stood over the massive corpse, breathing hard and bleeding from wounds that would leave permanent scars, but alive and victorious against an opponent that should have been impossible to defeat. Morrison claimed the Alpha's tusks and hide, but more importantly, he claimed the creature's territory and the respect of the surviving pack members. The remaining Vorthak did not flee or attack, but instead watched from the shadows as Morrison established his dominance over their domain. He had become something they understood and feared, an apex predator in their own environment. The victory changed Morrison in ways that went beyond simple survival. He had tapped into something primal and ancient, a warrior spirit that connected him to his ancestral heritage while adapting to challenges that his forefathers could never have imagined. He was no longer simply a soldier following orders, but a force of nature seeking justice against those who had betrayed him. Captain Murphy's next communication brought news that Pierce's corruption was spreading through the command structure, like a cancer. Several other teams had been lost under suspicious circumstances, always during missions that would have exposed inconvenient truths about the war's conduct. Morrison's survival was becoming politically inconvenient for people with the power to make entire units disappear. Morrison learned that his team members were officially dead, their families notified, and their personal effects distributed according to military protocol. They existed only in the underground caverns of Zirion Prime, fighting for survival against creatures that were not supposed to exist, while gathering evidence of betrayals that reached into the highest levels of human command. The knowledge that they were truly on their own crystallized Morrison's resolve to not merely survive, but to return and demand justice for the crimes committed against them. Pierce and his co-conspirators had made a critical error in assuming that death in the caverns was inevitable. They had underestimated both human determination and the warrior spirit that had carried Morrison's people through centuries of impossible odds. Morrison began planning not just for survival but for escape and return. He would emerge from the caverns stronger and more dangerous than before, armed with evidence that could topple the corrupt leadership and carrying skills that would make him a legend among those who fought for humanity's true values. The hunt was far from over, but Morrison was no longer the prey. Morrison emerged from the caves after 3 months of underground warfare, climbing through passages that led to the planet's surface under the cover of Zirion Prime's perpetual twilight. His body bore the scars of countless battles, but his mind carried something far more dangerous to Pierce and his conspirators. Morrison had become something that existed outside the normal chain of command, a ghost with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The planet's surface had changed during his time underground. What had been a battlefield was now a construction site where human and Zephyrian workers labored side by side to build facilities that looked disturbingly permanent. Morrison watched from concealment as enemy soldiers shared meals with human troops, their weapons stacked together like they were allies rather than combatants. Morrison's enhanced communication equipment, rebuilt from Zephyrian technology and Vorthak bones, picked up military transmissions that confirmed his worst fears. Pierce had negotiated a ceasefire with local Zephyrian forces, claiming it was necessary to search for survivors from the orbital bombardment. The ceasefire had stretched into something approaching permanent cooperation, with joint patrols and shared intelligence that would have been considered treason under normal circumstances. Captain Murphy's resistance cell had grown during Morrison's absence, but it had also been forced deeper underground as Pierce's influence expanded throughout the command structure. Murphy's latest transmission carried coordinates for a Zephyrian prison facility where human soldiers captured during recent operations were being held for interrogation and experimentation. Morrison infiltrated the facility using skills that combined military training with the predatory instincts he had developed during his time with the Vorthak. The prison was a converted mining complex surrounded by energy barriers and automated defenses. But Morrison had learned to move like something that belonged in the darkness between the lights. Inside the facility, Morrison found horrors that exceeded even his expectations of Zephyrian cruelty. Human prisoners were being subjected to the same enhancement procedures that had created the Vorthak, but with modifications designed to break their will rather than increase their combat effectiveness. The aliens were trying to create human slaves with enhanced physical capabilities but reduced mental independence. Morrison found his team members in separate cells deep within the complex, each one bearing the marks of experiments that had pushed the boundaries of what the human body could endure. Carlos had lost his left arm to alien surgeons who had been testing nerve regeneration procedures, but his demolitions expertise remained intact, along with a burning hatred for his captors. Lisa's eyesight had been damaged by drugs designed to enhance visual perception beyond human norms, leaving her partially blind but with an uncanny ability to detect movement and heat signatures that made her more dangerous rather than less. Tony bore surgical scars from procedures that had mapped every nerve in his body, but his medical knowledge had been enhanced rather than diminished by understanding alien physiology from a victim's perspective. Karen showed the most disturbing changes with neural implants that the aliens had used to test methods of controlling human thought and behavior. The devices had been designed to make her compliant and obedient, but Karen's technical expertise had allowed her to understand their function well enough to resist their influence while learning how they operated. Morrison's rescue operation was a masterpiece of violence and precision that would have made his Modoc ancestors proud. He moved through the facility like a force of nature, using weapons crafted from Vorthak bones and alien technology to eliminate guards and disable security systems. His approach was completely silent until the moment he chose to announce his presence with explosions that brought down entire sections of the complex. The reunion with his team was emotional but brief. Morrison could see that their experiences had changed them just as his time in the caves had changed him. But the core of what made them human had survived intact. They were damaged but not broken, scarred but not defeated, and ready to fight back against the forces that had tried to destroy them. Morrison learned from his team that Pierce's betrayal extended far beyond their single mission. The Colonel had been feeding information to the Zephyrians for months, allowing them to anticipate human military movements and prepare countermeasures. The orbital bombardment had been designed to eliminate the one team capable of exposing the full scope of his treachery. The aliens had been using captured human soldiers to test weapons and tactics that would be deployed against human colonies, with Pierce providing detailed information about military capabilities and weaknesses. The experimental programs were designed to create enhanced human slaves who could serve as interpreters and administrators in occupied territories. Morrison's team had resisted the enhancement procedures through a combination of military training and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender their humanity. Their captors had learned that humans were far more difficult to break than expected, requiring increasingly extreme measures that often resulted in death rather than compliance. The escape from the prison facility required Morrison to use every skill he had developed during his time underground. The team moved through ventilation systems and maintenance passages while avoiding automated defenses and alien patrols. Morrison's knowledge of Zephyrian technology, gained through months of studying equipment in the abandoned research facility, allowed him to disable security systems and redirect surveillance sensors. The final confrontation came when they reached the facility's main power core, where Morrison discovered evidence that would expose Pierce's entire conspiracy. Computer files detailed the Colonel's meetings with Zephyrian commanders, his provision of classified military information, and his participation in planning attacks against human positions. Morrison's team fought their way out of the facility while carrying data crystals that contained enough evidence to bring down Pierce and his co-conspirators. The battle was fierce but brief, with Morrison using tactics that combined human military doctrine with Vorthak pack-hunting techniques to overwhelm defenders who had never faced anything like his approach to warfare. The team escaped into the wilderness of Zerion Prime carrying weapons and equipment taken from their captors, but more importantly, carrying knowledge that could change the course of the war. They had survived betrayal, captivity, and experimentation to emerge stronger and more dangerous than their enemies had ever imagined possible. Morrison established contact with Captain Murphy's resistance network and began transmitting the evidence they had gathered. The data revealed corruption that reached into the highest levels of human command, with Pierce serving as the focal point of a conspiracy that threatened humanity's entire war effort. Morrison realized that their survival was no longer enough. They had become symbols of human resistance against both alien aggression and internal corruption, proof that humans could not be broken by any force that sought to destroy or control them. Their very existence was a threat to Pierce's plans and a beacon of hope for those who still believed in humanity's core values. The team prepared for the next phase of their campaign, knowing that they could never return to their previous lives or positions within the military hierarchy. They had become something new, warriors operating outside the normal chain of command but guided by principles that transcended official orders or political considerations. Morrison looked at his scarred and battered team members and saw reflections of his own transformation. They were no longer simply soldiers, but had become forces of nature dedicated to justice and truth. The hunt for Pierce and his conspirators was about to begin, and Morrison intended to bring the same relentless determination to that campaign that he had used to survive in the Vorthak caves. 3 days passed in the cavern, and Morrison learned more about survival than his military training had ever taught him. The creatures, which his team had started calling Vorthak after Lisa found alien writing that seemed to refer to them, operated, on a schedule that was both predictable and deadly. They hunted during what Morrison guessed were the planet's daylight hours above, leaving only guards to watch the trapped humans. Morrison used these periods to explore the cavern system, mapping passages and looking for escape routes while avoiding the Vorthak sentries. What he found instead was evidence of a larger horror. The caves connected to what had once been a Zephyrian research facility, now partially collapsed but still containing enough intact equipment to tell a story that made Morrison's blood run cold. The facility had been conducting biological experiments on the planet's native wildlife. Morrison found holding cells designed for creatures much smaller than the current Vorthak, along with injection systems and monitoring equipment that spoke of systematic enhancement programs. The aliens had been creating super predators, using genetic modification and chemical stimulation to turn ordinary animals into living weapons. Karen's technical expertise helped decode some of the alien data files that were still accessible through damaged computer terminals. The Vorthak had originally been simple burrowing animals, roughly the size of pigs and no more dangerous than Earth's wild boars. The Zephyrians had enhanced their size, intelligence, and aggression as part of a program to create biological weapons for deployment against human colonies. The research had been abandoned when the facility was damaged during the early stages of the war, leaving the enhanced creatures trapped underground with no purpose except survival. Over the years, they had developed their own primitive culture, while growing larger and more intelligent with each generation. They were no longer just weapons, but had become a new species entirely. Morrison realized that Pierce's betrayal ran deeper than simple corruption. The Colonel had known about this facility and the creatures it contained. The orbital bombardment had been designed not just to eliminate Morrison's team, but to seal them in with predators that would ensure no evidence of human command's knowledge ever surfaced. Lisa's sniper skills proved invaluable for hunting the smaller Vorthak that ventured too close to their defensive position. She managed to kill 2 juveniles with precise shots to their brainstem, the only spot where their enhanced biology was still vulnerable to conventional weapons. Morrison immediately claimed the bodies and began the grisly work of turning predator into tools. The Vorthak hide was incredibly tough, almost like natural body armor, but it could be worked with patience and the right techniques. Morrison used bone knives to carefully separate the skin from the muscle, then treated it with chemicals salvaged from their emergency medical supplies. The process took hours, but the result was material that could stop claws and teeth that had been designed to tear through military equipment. Carlos contributed his demolitions expertise to create traps that used the cavern's natural features to maximum advantage. He positioned shaped charges in narrow passages where a Vorthak charge would trigger pressure plates made from salvaged equipment. The creatures were too intelligent to fall for simple snares, but Carlos's devices were sophisticated, enough to fool even their enhanced minds. Tony's medical knowledge proved crucial for understanding Vorthak anatomy and physiology. The creature's enhanced biology included redundant organ systems and accelerated healing that made them incredibly difficult to kill. However, their neural system remained vulnerable at specific points where the alien modifications had created weaknesses rather than strengths. Morrison crafted armor from Vorthak hide and weapons from their bones and tusks. The process felt familiar in a way that connected him to his ancestral heritage, as if his Modoc great-great-grandfather was guiding his hands while he worked. The finished pieces were crude compared to military equipment, but perfectly suited for the environment and enemies he faced. The Alpha Vorthak seemed to understand that Morrison was becoming more dangerous, rather than weaker, as time passed. The creature began leading more aggressive probes of their defenses, testing different approaches and studying human responses. Morrison realized he was facing an opponent that learned from each encounter and adapted its tactics accordingly. Morrison established contact with the outside world using a long-range transmitter he cobbled together from pieces of Zephyrian equipment and human communication devices. The signal was weak and intermittent, but it reached a resistance cell operating in the outer system. Captain Helen Murphy's voice was the most beautiful sound Morrison had heard since the bombardment began. Murphy's intelligence network had been tracking Pierce's activities and suspected corruption in the upper command structure. Morrison's survival and testimony provided the missing pieces of a puzzle that revealed treason, reaching into the highest levels of human military leadership. Murphy promised to work on extracting Morrison's team, but she warned that Pierce's influence made official rescue impossible. Morrison learned that his team had been listed as killed in action, their deaths blamed on Zephyrian forces during a heroic intelligence-gathering mission. Pierce had even recommended them for posthumous medals, a cynical touch that showed the colonel's complete contempt for the people he had betrayed. Officially, Strike Team Phoenix no longer existed. The knowledge that they were on their own pushed Morrison to take greater risks in his campaign against the Vorthak pack. He began hunting the creatures actively rather than simply defending against their attacks, using stealth techniques learned from his ancestors combined with military tactical training. Morrison became a ghost in the darkness that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation was possible. Morrison's first solo kill was a juvenile, Vorthak that had separated from the pack to drink at the underground pool. Morrison struck from above, dropping from a rocky ledge with a bone spear that punched through the creature's spine and severed its connection to its enhanced nervous system. The kill was clean and quick, giving Morrison additional materials for weapons and armor. The Alpha responded to this escalation by bringing the entire pack together for a coordinated assault on Morrison's team's position. 8 fully grown Vorthak charged down the main passage while 2 more attempted to flank through side tunnels. Carlos's explosive traps took out 3 of the attackers, while Lisa's precise shooting killed 2 more before they reached close combat range. Morrison met the Alpha in single combat in the narrow space where Carlos's last trap had collapsed, part of the ceiling. The creature's enhanced strength and speed were matched against Morrison's growing skill with bone weapons and his intimate knowledge of Vorthak anatomy. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes but felt like hours as Morrison dodged tusks that could split him in half and claws that could tear through steel. Morrison's victory came when he managed to drive a sharpened Vorthak tusk through the Alpha's left eye and into its brain. The creature died instantly, its enhanced biology finally overwhelmed by damage to its critical neural pathways. The surviving pack members retreated into the deep caves, leaving Morrison standing over the body of their former leader. The Alphas. Death changed the dynamic in the cavern. Morrison was no longer prey but the new apex predator in an environment where only strength and intelligence determined survival. He claimed the Alpha's tusks and hide as trophies, but more importantly, he had proven to himself and his team that even enhanced alien bioweapons could be defeated by human determination and ingenuity. Morrison used the respite after the Alpha's death to strengthen his team's position and plan their eventual escape from the underground prison. The Vorthak would regroup and select a new leader, but Morrison intended to be ready for them when they returned. The hunt had only begun, and Morrison planned to finish it on his own terms. The creature that stepped into their lights was a nightmare made flesh. It stood as tall as a horse but was built like a wild boar that had been fed steroids and hatred for its entire life. Massive tusks curved from its lower jaw, each one longer than Morrison's forearm and sharp enough to punch through body armor. Its hide was covered in scars that spoke of countless battles, and its small red eyes burned with an intelligence that was far too human for comfort. Morrison raised his rifle and put 3 round center mass into the beast's chest. The bullets struck with sounds like hammers hitting steel, and the creature staggered but did not fall. Instead, it let out a roar that shook dust from the cavern ceiling and charged forward with speed that defied its massive size. Carlos rolled left and triggered one of his remaining explosive charges, but the creature was already past the blast radius by the time the device detonated. Lisa's sniper rifle spoke twice, aiming for the thing's eyes, but the beast moved its head at the last second and the bullets sparked off its tusks instead of finding their target. Morrison dove right as the creature thundered past their position, its hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground. Tony dragged Karen behind a boulder while trying to keep his medical equipment from being scattered by the beast's charge. The creature skidded to a stop at the water's edge and turned around with the fluid grace of a predator that had done this dance many times before. More growls echoed from the darkness, and Morrison realized they were facing an entire pack of these things. His military training had covered hostile wildlife, but nothing in the manuals had prepared him for creatures that combined the size of elephants with the aggression of wolverines and the pack-hunting intelligence of wolves. The alpha beast, for that was clearly what they were facing, circled their position while its packmates remained hidden in the shadows. Morrison could see their eyes reflecting his helmet lights like red stars scattered through the darkness. The alpha was testing them, learning their capabilities and weaknesses before committing to a full attack. Morrison's Modoc ancestors had faced impossible odds with primitive weapons against enemies who possessed superior technology and numbers. They had survived by being smarter, tougher, and more ruthless than their opponents. Morrison felt that ancient warrior spirit awakening in his blood as he studied the creature that was studying him. The beast's hide was thick but not impenetrable. Morrison's bullets had penetrated, though not deeply enough to cause serious damage. The creature favored its left front leg slightly, suggesting an old injury that might be exploited. Most importantly, it was intelligent enough to be cautious, which meant it could be outthought as well as outfought. Morrison signaled his team to fall back deeper into the cavern while he kept the alpha's attention focused on himself. The creature followed, but slowly, matching his pace like a cat playing with a wounded mouse. Behind the alpha, Morrison could see the shapes of its packmates flowing through the darkness like living shadows. The cavern system was more complex than Morrison had initially realized. Passages branched off in multiple directions, some leading up toward what might be surface access, others descending deeper into the planet's crust. The walls were covered with strange markings that looked too regular to be natural formations, but too alien to be human writing. Lisa found a defensive position in a narrow passage where the creatures would have to attack one at a time, rather than using their numbers advantage. Carlos set up his remaining explosive charges to create a killing field that would funnel any attack into Lisa's line of fire. Tony got Karen stabilized and conscious, though she was still too dizzy from her head injury to be much help in a fight. The alpha beast seemed to understand their tactical thinking because it stopped its advance and began making sounds that were clearly communication with its pack. Morrison heard answering calls from different directions and realized the creatures were coordinating their attack. Whatever these things were, they possessed a level of intelligence that made them far more dangerous than simple predators. Morrison studied the bone fragments scattered throughout the cavern and began to see patterns in the remains. Most of the skeletons were incomplete, suggesting the creatures ate their prey, but saved certain bones for unknown purposes. Some of the larger bones had been shaped into tools or weapons, while others had been arranged in patterns that looked almost ritualistic. Karen's technical training allowed her to recognize artificial modifications in some of the bone fragments. These creatures were not just intelligent, they were using technology of a sort. Simple tools made from the bones and metals of their victims, but tools nonetheless. Morrison realized they were not facing wild animals, but rather a primitive civilization that had been trapped underground for unknown reasons. The first probe attack came without warning. A younger creature, perhaps half the size of the alpha, charged down the passage toward Lisa's position. She put 2 rounds through its skull before it covered half the distance, but the attack had served its purpose. The alpha now knew exactly where they were positioned and how quickly they could respond to threats. Morrison made a decision that would have been called insane by any rational person. Instead of waiting for the pack to attack on their terms, he would take the fight to them using the tactics his ancestors had developed for fighting superior forces. He would become the hunter instead of the hunted. Morrison stripped his rifle down to its essential components and redistributed the parts among his team members. He kept the barrel and firing mechanism while giving Carlos the ammunition and Lisa the scope. Tony received the power pack and Karen got the targeting computer. If the creatures overran their position, they would find weapons parts that were useless without the other components. Next, Morrison began gathering the bone fragments and metal pieces scattered throughout the cavern. His Modoc heritage included knowledge of traditional weapon making, skills that had been considered quaint historical curiosities until this moment. Morrison began crafting spears and knives from the bones of the creature's previous victims. The alpha beast watched these preparations with what Morrison could only describe as curiosity. The creature seemed to understand that Morrison was adapting to his environment in ways that indicated intelligence rather than simple desperation. Morrison got the distinct impression that the alpha was beginning to see him as a potential rival, rather than just another meal. Lisa's sniper training included advanced observation techniques, and she reported that the pack consisted of at least 8 individuals ranging in size from juveniles to adults. The Alpha was clearly the largest and most scarred, but several others showed signs of being experienced fighters. They moved with the coordination of a military unit rather than the chaos of a wild pack. Morrison finished his first spear just as the Alpha decided to test his new weapons. The creature charged directly at Morrison's position, its massive tusks aimed at his chest. Morrison waited until the last possible second before rolling aside and driving his bone spear deep into the creature's flank. The spear point, carved from the thigh bone of some previous victim and sharpened to a needle point, penetrated the beast's hide and drew a spray of dark blood. The creature roared in pain and surprise, but Morrison was already moving, using the spear as a lever to stay out of range of the snapping jaws and slashing tusks. Morrison twisted the spear and drove it deeper before releasing it and rolling away as the creature tried to crush him against the cavern wall. The Alpha turned with fury in its red eyes, but Morrison was already gone, melting back into the shadows like his ancestors had done when facing cavalry charges and rifle volleys. The message had been delivered and received. Morrison was not helpless, prey but a dangerous opponent who would extract a price in blood for every inch of ground. The Alpha beast understood this language perfectly, and Morrison saw something like respect flicker in those intelligent red eyes before the creature withdrew to plan its next move. The ship screamed as it died around them. Morrison felt the deck plates buckle and tear beneath his boots while the bombardment from above continued to rain death on what remained of the Zephyrian vessel. He pushed his team toward the cargo bay, hoping the reinforced bulkheads might offer some protection from the hell that Pierce had unleashed upon them. Carlos stumbled as another blast wave shook the corridor, his demolitions expertise telling him exactly how much explosive force was being directed at their position. He shouted over the noise that the bombardment pattern was designed for complete vaporization rather than tactical destruction. Someone wanted to make absolutely certain that nothing survived, not even molecular traces that might be analyzed later. The cargo bay doors had been twisted open by the ship's impact with the planet's surface, revealing a massive chamber filled with alien equipment and supplies. Morrison led his team inside just as the corridor behind them collapsed in a shower of sparks and molten metal. They were trapped, but at least they were alive for the moment. Lisa found a position near the bay's observation windows and used her sniper scope to assess their situation. Through the shattered transparent aluminum, she could see the purple sky filled with the bright flashes of human weapons firing from orbit. The bombardment was systematic and thorough, designed by someone who understood military tactics well, enough to ensure total destruction. The next blast struck directly above them, and Morrison felt the entire ship lurch sideways as its remaining structural supports gave way. The cargo bay floor tilted at an impossible angle, and suddenly everything was sliding toward the gaping hole where the bay doors used to be. Morrison grabbed for anything solid as his team members scrambled for handholds on equipment that was also sliding toward the opening. Karen's technical training had taught her to recognize the signs of catastrophic structural failure, and she screamed a warning that they had seconds before the entire section collapsed. Morrison saw Tony lose his grip on a supply crate and slide toward the hole. Without thinking, Morrison dove after his medic and managed to grab the man's wrist just as he went over the edge. The weight of Tony's body nearly pulled Morrison into the abyss as well, but Carlos and Lisa managed to grab his legs and form a human chain. Below them, the hole opened into darkness so deep that their helmet lights could not penetrate it. Morrison could hear Tony's breathing over the comm system, quick and shallow with fear but still controlled. The ship gave another massive shudder, and Morrison realized they were all about to follow Tony into the depths whether they wanted to or not. The cargo bay was breaking apart, and the section they were clinging to was about to separate from the rest of the vessel. Morrison made the hardest decision of his military career and told his team to let go. They fell through darkness that seemed to last forever. Morrison's enhanced vision could make out the walls of what appeared to be a natural cave system, though how a cave could exist beneath a crashed spaceship made no sense. The fall ended in freezing water that knocked the breath from his lungs and sent shock waves of cold through his body armor. Morrison surfaced in an underground pool and immediately began searching for his team members. His helmet lights cut through the darkness revealing a cavern so large that the beams disappeared into black void before finding the far walls. Carlos surfaced nearby, coughing up water but apparently uninjured. Lisa's voice came over the comm system from somewhere to their left, and Tony responded from the darkness ahead. The water was shallow enough to stand in, but the bottom was uneven and covered with something that felt like broken glass under their boots. Morrison helped Carlos to the shore, which turned out to be a rocky beach made of the same sharp material that covered the pool's bottom. Their helmet lights revealed that the fragments were actually pieces of bone, some small enough to be from rodents but others large enough to come from creatures the size of horses. Karen's voice was missing from their comm checks, and Morrison felt his heart sink as he realized she might not have survived the fall. They spread out along the shoreline, calling her name and sweeping their lights across the water's surface. Tony found her floating face down near what appeared to be the pool's deepest section. Morrison and Carlos pulled Karen from the water, while Tony worked his medical magic. She was unconscious but breathing, with a head injury that had probably knocked her out during the fall. Tony's scanner showed a concussion, but no signs of internal bleeding or brain damage. She would live, but she would need time to recover. The cave system around them was like nothing Morrison had ever seen. The walls were smooth as glass in some places, and rough as broken stone in others. Strange formations hung from the ceiling, but they were too regular to be natural stalactites. They looked more like the ribs of some massive creature that had died and been fossilized in place. Lisa's military training had included survival in hostile environments, and she quickly identified several problems with their situation. The air was breathable but had a strange metallic taste that suggested they were not in a natural cave system. The temperature was cold enough to be dangerous over time, but not immediately life-threatening. Most importantly, there was no obvious way out except back through the pool they had fallen into. Morrison explored the shoreline while his team tended to Karen and took inventory of their remaining equipment. Most of their gear had been damaged in the fall, but they still had basic weapons, some medical supplies, and emergency rations for about 3 days. Their communication equipment was completely destroyed, leaving them cut off from any possible rescue. The bone fragments on the ground told a story that Morrison did not like. Some were clearly from Zephyrian creatures, identifiable by their distinctive chitinous structure and unusual mineral content. Others were from animals that Morrison did not recognize, but the bite marks and claw scratches suggested they had been killed by something large and aggressive. A sound echoed through the cavern, somewhere between a growl and a snort, that made Morrison's Modoc warrior instinct scream danger. The sound was answered by similar calls from different directions, suggesting they were not alone in the cave system. Whatever lived down here was territorial, aggressive, and probably hungry. Morrison gathered his team into a defensive position against one of the cave walls and tried to process what had happened to them. Pierce had tried to murder them with an orbital bombardment. They had fallen into what appeared to be an underground predator's den, and they were now cut off from any hope of rescue with limited supplies and damaged equipment. The growling sounds grew closer, and Morrison caught a glimpse of something massive moving in the darkness beyond their lights. It was easily the size of an elephant, but moved with the quick, aggressive motions of a much smaller predator. Morrison realized that they had survived Pierce's betrayal, only to face something that might be even more dangerous. Karen regained consciousness as the first creature stepped into the light, and her scream echoed through the cavern like a challenge that was immediately answered by roars from the darkness all around them. Jake Morrison crouched behind the twisted metal remains of what used to be a Zephyrian transport ship and checked his rifle one more time. The weapon felt solid in his hands, familiar like an old friend. Around him, the purple sky of Zirian Prime cast strange shadows across the battlefield, where dozens of alien and human ships lay scattered like broken toys. His team moved with the silent precision that had kept them alive through 3 years of the bloodiest war humanity had ever fought. Carlos Rivera checked the explosive charges on his belt while scanning the horizon through his scope. Lisa Park had already found her sniper position on a rocky outcrop 50 meters away. Tony Walsh kept his medical kit ready and his eyes on the team's vitals displayed on his wrist screen. Karen Hughes worked her fingers across her communication device, maintaining contact with their command ship orbiting high above. Morrison had earned his rank through battles that would have broken lesser men. His Modoc ancestors had fought against impossible odds on Earth centuries ago, and that same warrior blood ran through his veins. The other Marines called him Ghost because he could move through enemy territory without making a sound and strike without warning. Today, that reputation would be put to the ultimate test. Colonel Nathan Pierce's voice crackled through their comm units with the usual military authority that brooked no questions. The mission was simple in concept but deadly in execution. 40. Inside the crashed Zephyrian command vessel lay intelligence data that could change the course of the war. The aliens had developed a new weapon system, something that could punch through human shield technology like it was made of paper. High. Command needed that data, and Strike Team Phoenix was the only unit capable of getting it. Morrison signaled his team to move forward. They had rehearsed this operation dozens of times in simulation, but reality always brought new challenges. The crashed ship's hull had been torn open by the impact, creating a maze of twisted corridors and unstable passages. Emergency lighting flickered red and blue, casting eerie colors on the alien symbols carved into the walls. The first Zephyrian patrol appeared exactly where intelligence had predicted. 3 tall insectoid creatures with chitinous armor and plasma weapons that hummed with deadly energy. Lisa's rifle spoke once, twice, 3 times from her hidden position. The aliens dropped without ever knowing death had found them. Morrison's team moved forward like shadows, leaving no trace of their passage. Inside the ship, the air tasted of ozone and something sweet that made their throats burn. Alien technology lined the walls, pulsing with soft light that seemed almost alive. Morrison had always felt uncomfortable around Zephyrian equipment. There was something wrong about machines that grew instead of being built, something that reminded him too much of living things that had been forced into unnatural shapes. Karen found the data core in the ship's central command chamber. The device looked like a crystalline brain suspended in a web of fiber optic nerves. She worked her technical magic while the rest of the team maintained security. Morrison watched the corridors, his enhanced hearing picking up sounds that normal humans would miss. Somewhere in the distance, metal groaned as the ship's damaged structure continued to settle into the planet's surface. 20 minutes passed before Karen announced success. The data crystal containing the weapon specifications glowed in her hand, like a captured star. Morrison felt the satisfaction of a mission accomplished, but something nagged at the back of his mind. Pierce had been unusually specific about the timing of this operation, insisting they complete it within a narrow window that seemed arbitrary. As they prepared to leave the ship, Pierce's voice returned to their comm units, but something had changed in his tone. The colonel spoke with the careful words of a man reading from a script rather than giving spontaneous orders. He informed them that the situation had developed complications, and new intelligence suggested the ship might be rigged with a delayed destruction mechanism. Immediate evacuation was no longer possible due to increased enemy activity in the area. Morrison's warrior instincts, honed by generations of fighters who had learned to read danger in the smallest details, began screaming warnings. Pierce had never shown concern for theoretical risks before, and the colonel's explanation felt hollow. Morrison tried to raise questions about the change in orders, but Pierce cut him off with the sharp authority that ended all discussion. The orbital bombardment began without warning. The first blast struck the ship's stern, sending shockwaves through the corridors that knocked Morrison's team to their knees. Emergency alarms shrieked as the vessel's remaining power systems overloaded. Morrison realized with growing horror that the bombardment was coming from human ships, not Zephyrian ones. Carlos shouted over the noise that the attack pattern was designed to ensure total destruction rather than precision strikes against specific targets. These were not the careful bombing runs used to eliminate enemy positions while preserving valuable intelligence. This was the kind of massive firepower unleashed when command wanted to make sure nothing survived. Lisa's sniper training had taught her to read tactical situations at a glance, and her voice carried deadly certainty when she announced that their own fleet was trying to kill them. Tony's medical scanner detected massive energy signatures approaching from orbit, the kind that preceded planet-cracking bombardments. Karen's communication equipment picked up military traffic confirming that Strike Team Phoenix was being listed. as lost in action even before the bombardment reached its peak. The truth hit Morrison like a physical blow to the chest. Pierce had sent them here to die. The mission had been real, but it had also been a trap designed to eliminate the one team capable of exposing whatever game the Colonel was really playing. Morrison had seen corruption before in the ranks. Officers who sold information or supplies for personal gain, but this was betrayal on a scale that threatened everything humanity was fighting for. Another blast struck closer to their position, and Morrison felt the ship begin to break apart around them. He grabbed the data crystal from Karen's hand and made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Rather than try to escape through corridors that were collapsing by the second, he would take his team deeper into the ship, toward the massive cargo holds that might offer some protection from the bombardment. The deck beneath their feet tilted at a crazy angle as the ship's hull cracked open like an egg. Morrison led his team through a passage that suddenly became a vertical shaft as gravity shifted. Behind them, the corridor they had just abandoned disappeared in a ball of superheated plasma that turned metal into vapor. Pierce's voice returned to their comm units one final time, offering what sounded like genuine regret as he wished them peace in death. Morrison ripped the communication device from his helmet and hurled it against the wall where it shattered into a dozen pieces. Whatever happened next, he would face it without lies from the man who had decided to murder his own people for reasons that Morrison could not yet understand but swore he would eventually discover.